At my father's while reading, I noticed something small that didn't seem important at first. My name wasn't on the printed seating card. It wasn't even misspelled. It simply wasn't there. I stood at the entrance of the law office conference room, holding my purse a little tighter than usual, scanning the neat row of name placards arranged around the long mahogany table. Each one was written in clean, black ink on thick cream cardstock. Daniel Harper, Melissa Harper, Thomas Reed. Even my sister-in-law, who hadn't visited my father in over a year, had her place marked clearly. But not me. For a moment, I thought it might have been a simple oversight. These things happen. Offices get busy. Assistants make mistakes. So I smiled. That's what I've always done when something feels off. I smoothed down the front of my navy blue dress, the one I had worn to my husband's funeral 3 years ago, and stepped inside as if nothing was wrong. I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the end, and let me know where you're watching from. I never imagined that a single missing name card would be the first sign that I had already been erased from my own family. The room smelled faintly of polished wood and paper. Old paper, the kind that carries weight. Legal weight. Final decisions.
Permanent ending. My father would have appreciated that.
He believed in order, in structure, in things being done properly, which is why what happened next made even less sense. Why are you here? The voice came from my younger brother, Daniel. He didn't raise it. He didn't need to. It cut clean enough as it was. I turned toward him slowly, still holding that same polite smile I had practiced over decades of family dinners and careful conversations. I'm here for the reading, I said, keeping my voice calm. Same as everyone else. Daniel exchanged a glance with Melissa, his wife, who was already seated, legs crossed, fingers resting lightly on the table, as if she belonged there more than anyone else. Her eyes flicked up to me briefly.
Cold.
Assessing. Then gone again. You might want to check with Mr. Collins, Daniel said, nodding toward the head of the table where our father's attorney was, organizing a stack of documents. There's been some changes. Changes. It was such a harmless word. I nodded, still smiling, and walked toward Mr. Collins. My heels clicked softly against the hardwood floor, each step echoing just a little louder than it should have in the quiet room. Mr. Collins, I said gently, I think there may be a mistake. I didn't see my name on the seating list. He looked up at me over his glasses, and for just a second, I saw something shift in his expression. Not surprise. Not confusion. Something closer to discomfort. Yes, he said, clearing his throat. Mrs. Harper, please, have a seat anywhere for now. Anywhere. Not your seat. Not your place. Just anywhere. I chose a chair near the end of the table. Not too close. Not too far. The kind of position you take when you're not quite sure where you belong anymore. The leather was cold beneath my hands as I rested them in my lap. I folded them neatly, one over the other, just like my mother used to teach me. Posture matters, she would say. Even when no one is looking. Everyone was looking now. Or rather, they were looking around me. Conversations continued in low murmurs. Papers shuffled. Phones were checked. But no one spoke to me directly. It was as if I had become part of the furniture. Invisible but still there. I glanced at the empty chair beside Daniel. Once, not so long ago, that seat would have been mine without question. I used to sit there during holidays, during birthdays, during every family gathering that mattered. I used to be the one who organized those gatherings. The one who made sure everyone had a place. Funny how quickly things can change. Mr. Collins cleared his throat again, louder this time. Thank you all for coming, he began, his voice taking on that formal tone lawyers seem to carry like a second skin. As you know, we are here to review the final will and testament of Mr. Robert Harper. My father's name settled over the room like a weight. Robert Harper. To the world, he was a respected businessman.
Disciplined. Fair.
A man who built everything from nothing. To me, he was the one who used to sit on the edge of my bed when I was little, telling me stories until I fell asleep. The one who used to say, "You're the strong one. I can always count on you." I held on to that memory as Mr. Collins began reading. Names were called. Assets were listed. Properties, accounts, investments, everything laid out in careful, precise language. Daniel leaned forward slightly when his name was mentioned, his expression tightening just enough to betray interest. Melissa didn't react much, but I noticed the small, satisfied curve at the corner of her lips. Thomas Reed, my cousin, shifted in his seat, clearly surprised at what he was receiving. I listened. I waited. I kept my breathing steady, my posture straight, my expression neutral. Because I knew my name would come. It had to. I was his daughter. The one who stayed. The one who took him to his appointments when the others were too busy. The one who sat with him during those long, quiet evenings when the house felt too big and too empty. I waited for Mr. Collins to say it. Just 2 words. My name. But they never came. The reading continued. Line after line. Clause after clause. Until finally, Mr. Collins closed the folder. That concludes the will, he said. Silence. Not the peaceful kind. The heavy kind. The kind that presses against your chest and makes it just a little harder to breathe. I didn't move. For a moment, I thought perhaps I had missed it. Perhaps it had been said quietly, buried somewhere between legal terms and formal phrasing. But I knew better. I had been listening too carefully for that. I turned my head slightly, looking toward Daniel. He didn't meet my eyes. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly, as if something long anticipated had finally been confirmed. Melissa glanced at me then. This time, she didn't look away. There was no warmth in her gaze.
No apology.
Just certainty. And then she said it.
Softly. Calmly.
As if she were commenting on the weather. I think you should leave. The words hung in the air for a second before settling. No one corrected her. No one said she was out of line. No one even looked surprised. I felt every eye in the room shift, not toward me, but past me, around me, as if waiting for me to understand something that had already been decided long before I walked through that door. This doesn't concern you anymore, Daniel added, his voice quieter than before but no less final. I nodded. Just once. Slowly. Because in that moment, I understood something very clearly. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't an oversight. It wasn't even a last-minute change. This had been planned. Carefully. Quietly. Completely. I placed my hands on the table and pushed myself up from the chair.
No sudden movements.
No raised voice. I reached for my purse, adjusting the strap over my shoulder. I see, I said. And I meant it. I saw everything now. Without another word, I turned and walked toward the door. My heels echoed again against the hardwood floor, steady and even. No one stopped me. No one called my name, because to them, I didn't have one anymore. But as I reached the door and placed my hand on the handle, one thought settled in my mind with a clarity that surprised even me. They thought I had nothing. They thought I had been left out completely. They thought this was the end of my place in this family. I opened the door and stepped out. They were wrong. They just didn't know it yet. The hallway outside the conference room felt colder than it should have. Not the kind of cold you notice on your skin, but the kind that settles somewhere deeper in your chest, in your stomach, in the space where something used to feel steady. I walked slowly toward the exit, my hand still wrapped around the strap of my purse, my steps measured, controlled. I didn't rush. I didn't stop. I just kept moving. The receptionist glanced up when I passed her desk. For a second, it looked like she might say something. Maybe ask if everything was all right. Maybe offer one of those polite, rehearsed smiles people use when they sense discomfort but don't understand it. But she didn't. She just looked back down at her computer. And that was fine. By the time I stepped outside, the late afternoon sun had already begun to soften. The lights stretched long across the parking lot, casting shadows that made everything look slightly unfamiliar, like I was seeing a place I had known for years, but from a distance I couldn't quite close. I stood there for a moment. Just one moment. Then I walked to my car. It was the same car I had driven my father to his appointments in. The same passenger seat where he used to sit, adjusting his jacket, asking me if I remembered to bring the paperwork. "You always remember," he would say. I opened the driver's door and slid inside. Closed it. And suddenly, the silence was complete.
No voices. No footsteps.
No legal language echoing in the background. Just me. And the faint ticking sound of the engine cooling under the hood. I placed my purse on the passenger seat and rested my hands on the steering wheel, fingers still, eyes forward. I didn't cry. That might sound strange. After everything that had just happened, you might expect tears, anger, something loud. But there was none of that. Just a kind of stillness. The kind that comes when something shifts so deeply, your body hasn't quite caught up to it yet. I replayed the moment in my head. Not the whole reading. Just the important parts. My name not being called. The way Daniel avoided looking at me. Melissa's voice, calm, almost gentle, telling me to leave. And the silence that followed. That silence told me more than anything else. Because silence, in a room full of people, is never empty. It's agreement. It's confirmation. It means the decision had already been made. Long before I walked in. I exhaled slowly and leaned back against the seat. Something about that realization didn't break me. It clarified things. Because if this had been a mistake, someone would have said something. If this had been confusion, someone would have stepped in. If there had been even the smallest piece of hesitation, I would have seen it. But there was none. Which meant one thing. They all knew. I turned the key in the ignition, but I didn't drive right away. Instead, I let the engine run quietly as I stared out at the empty spaces in front of me. A memory surfaced then. Not a big one. Not dramatic. Just something small. It was from about 6 months before my father passed. I had been in his kitchen, standing by the sink, washing dishes after dinner. He was sitting at the table behind me reading. Something, papers, I think. Legal documents, maybe. He had been going through a lot of them toward the end. "You don't have to stay so late," he had said without looking up. "I know," I replied. "But I want to." He nodded, still reading. There was a pause. Then he said something I didn't think much about at the time. "Not everything is as simple as it looks on paper." I remember glancing over my shoulder. "What do you mean?" But he just shook his head slightly. "Just don't assume things," he said. "Especially not when it comes to family." At the time, I thought he was talking about Daniel. Or maybe about the business. I didn't press him. I wish I had. I blinked, pulling myself back into the present. The engine was still running. The parking lot was nearly empty now. And for the first time since I walked out of that room, something shifted. Not grief. Not anger. Something else. Something quieter. But stronger. Because the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. My father was many things. Strict. Careful. Sometimes distant. But he was not careless. He didn't forget details. He didn't overlook things that mattered. And whether anyone else in that room wanted to admit it or not, I mattered to him. I knew that. Not because of what he said in front of others, but because of what he said when it was just the two of us. Because of the way he trusted me with things he didn't trust anyone else with. Because of the way he looked at me in those final weeks, not with doubt, not with distance, but with something close to certainty. So no, this didn't feel right. I reached over and picked at my purse, unzipping the front pocket. Inside were the same things I always carried. My phone, my keys, a small notepad, and a folded piece of paper I hadn't looked at in months. I paused, then pulled it out. It wasn't anything official, not a legal document, just something my father had handed me one evening, almost absent-mindedly. "Keep this somewhere safe," he had said. I hadn't asked questions. I just folded it and put it away. At the time, it didn't seem important. Now, I wasn't so sure. I stared at it for a moment, then carefully unfolded the paper. The ink was slightly faded, but still clear enough to read. Numbers, names, and one line that stood out more than the rest. I didn't fully understand it yet.
But I didn't need to. Not yet.
I folded the paper again, slower this time, and placed it back into my purse. Then I finally shifted the car into drive. As I pulled out of the parking lot, one thought settled firmly into place. They believed the story that had been handed to them in that room. They believed the version of the truth that was read out loud. And maybe they believed I would accept it, that I would walk away quietly, disappear the way they expected me to. I kept my eyes on the road, my hands steady on the wheel. I didn't need to prove anything right now. I didn't need to confront anyone, because whatever had been decided in that room wasn't the full story. And for the first time since my name wasn't called, I wasn't thinking about what I had lost. I was thinking about what I hadn't seen yet. And that changed everything. I didn't go straight home. That surprised me. For years, home had always been my first instinct. After long days, after difficult conversations, after anything that left me feeling unsettled, I would go back to the same quiet house, make a cup of tea, and let the silence settle around me. But that afternoon, something in me resisted that routine. Instead, I drove without a clear destination, letting the road decide for me. The town looked the same as it always had. Familiar streets, the same grocery store on the corner, the same gas station where my father used to insist on pumping the gas himself, even when his hands had started to tremble. Everything looked unchanged, but it didn't feel that way. Because once something shifts inside you, the world doesn't quite sit the same anymore. I stopped at a red light and caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. For a moment, I just looked at myself. Silver hair pulled back neatly, the same navy dress, the same calm expression I had worn inside that conference room. No one looking at me now would have guessed what had just happened. And that was exactly the problem. I had spent so many years being composed, reasonable, understanding, the one who didn't make things harder than they needed to be, the one who adjusted, the one who stepped back. I blinked, and the light turned green. I drove another block, then another, until without really thinking about it, I found myself pulling into a small parking lot I hadn't visited in a long time. First National Bank. I sat there for a second, hands still on the steering wheel. Then I turned off the engine. I wasn't entirely sure why I had come here. Not consciously, at least. But something about that folded paper in my purse, something about the way my father had handed it to me, had started to feel heavier the longer I drove. Like it wasn't just a piece of paper anymore. Like it was a question. And I needed an answer. I stepped out of the car and walked toward the entrance. The glass doors slid open with a soft mechanical hum, and a familiar scent greeted me. Clean air, polished floors, a faint trace of coffee from somewhere behind the counters. It had been a while since I'd been inside. My father handled most of the financial matters. That had always been his role. Less for you to worry about, he used to say. At the time, I had been grateful. Now, I wasn't so sure. A young teller looked up and smiled as I approached. "Good afternoon, ma'am. How can I help you today?" Her voice was warm, professional, the kind of tone that made everything feel simple. I returned the smile, just slightly. "I need to ask about an account," I said. "Of course," she replied. "Do you have the account number?" I hesitated for just a moment, then reached into my purse and pulled out the folded paper. My fingers were steady as I opened it. The same numbers stared back at me. The same line I hadn't understood before. I slid the paper across the counter. "This," I said quietly. She glanced down at it, her expression shifting just slightly as she read. "Just one moment," she said, her tone changing, not drastically, but enough for me to notice. She typed something into her computer, her fingers moving quickly over the keyboard. Then she paused, looked at the screen, looked back at the paper, and then she stood up. "I'm going to get my manager," she said. That was the moment something in me settled. Not panic, not fear. Something closer to confirmation. Because people don't call their manager for simple questions. They call them when something matters. I nodded. "Of course." She disappeared through a door behind the counter, leaving me standing there alone. I glanced around the bank. A couple sat in chairs near the window, speaking quietly with another employee. Someone else was filling out a form at a small desk by the wall. Everything looked normal.
Calm.
Routine. But I could feel it again, that same quiet shift inside me. The same feeling I had when my name wasn't called. Only this time it was different. Because this time, it didn't feel like something was being taken away. It felt like something was about to be revealed. A few moments later, a woman in her 50s approached me, her posture confident, her expression carefully neutral. "Mrs. Harper?" she asked. I nodded. "Yes."
I'm Linda.
"I manage this branch." Would you mind coming with me for a moment? There was something in her voice, not urgency, not alarm, but a kind of quiet seriousness. I followed her down a short hallway and into a private office. She closed the door behind us and gestured for me to sit. I did, folding my hands neatly in my lap again, just like before. She sat across from me, placing the paper gently on the desk between us. Where did you get this? She asked. My father, I said. He gave it to me a few months ago. She studied my face for a moment, as if measuring something. Then she turned her computer screen slightly toward me. Mrs. Harper, she said carefully, this account is not a standard account. I didn't respond. I just listened, because I had learned something already. The most important information is usually said quietly. This is part of a private trust, she continued. It was established several years ago. A trust. The word settled slowly. Heavy. Important. And the primary beneficiary listed here, she paused, glancing at the screen again, is you. For a second, the room felt very still. Not empty, not silent, just still. I didn't react immediately, didn't lean forward, didn't ask questions, because reacting too quickly would have broken something. And I wasn't ready to break anything yet. Are you certain? I asked, my voice even. She nodded.
Yes.
Your name is clearly listed as the primary beneficiary. In fact, she clicked something on the screen. You are also listed as the controlling party, pending activation. Activation. Another word that carried weight. What does that mean? I asked. It means, she said, choosing her words carefully, that once the appropriate conditions are met, you have full authority over the assets within this trust. Assets. I thought back to the conference room.
To the will.
To the careful reading of everything my father had supposedly left behind. And for the first time, I understood something very clearly. That wasn't everything. I sat there quietly, letting the pieces begin to shift into place. My father's voice echoed faintly in my memory. Not everything is as simple as it looks on paper. He hadn't been speaking in general terms.
He had been warning me.
And I had almost missed it. Linda watched me closely. If you'd like, she said, we can go over the details together. There's quite a bit here. I nodded slowly. Yes, I said. I think I'd like that. Because as the truth began to unfold in that small office, one thing became certain. The story they told in that room, the one where I had nothing, was only half of it, and they had no idea. Linda didn't rush. That was the first thing I noticed. She didn't flood me with numbers. Didn't overwhelm me with explanations. She moved slowly, deliberately, like someone who understood that information like this needed space to settle. She turned the screen slightly more toward me. There are multiple components to this trust, she said. Accounts, investments, and a property holding. Property. The word landed differently than the others. Not because it was unfamiliar, but because of what it implied. My father had already distributed everything, hadn't he? That's what they made it sound like in that room. Every asset accounted for. Every decision finalized. Every name except mine. I kept my expression neutral. What kind of property? I asked. Linda clicked through another file. A residential property, she said. Held under the trust for approximately 5 years. 5 years. That was before his health began to decline. Before the hospital visits. Before Daniel started helping with the paperwork. I leaned back slightly in the chair, my hands still folded in my lap. And no one else is listed? I asked. She shook her head. No co-beneficiaries. No secondary names attached to the primary holding. Just me. The room felt quieter after that. Not empty. Focused. Because now the picture was starting to form. Not completely, but enough to see the outline. My father hadn't forgotten me. He had separated me. Deliberately. Carefully. Quietly. I looked down at the paper again. The one I had carried for months without thinking much about it. The one he had handed to me without explanation. Keep this somewhere safe. At the time, it felt like a small thing. Now it didn't. Linda continued speaking, her voice steady. There are also recurring transfers into the account, she said. Modest amounts over time, but consistent. I glanced up. From where? She paused, then turned the screen again.
A business account, she said.
Registered under your father's company. That made me sit a little straighter. My father had sold the company years ago. At least, that's what Daniel had told everyone. I didn't interrupt. I just listened, because something was becoming very clear. There were two versions of my father's life. The one they showed, and the one he kept hidden. And these transfers, I said slowly. They're still active? Linda nodded. Yes. Still active. Even after the will had been read. Even after everything had supposedly been finalized. I exhaled quietly. Not in shock. Not in relief. Just understanding. Because now I knew something they didn't. Whatever they thought they had secured in that room, it wasn't everything. Not even close. Linda folded her hands on the desk. Mrs. Harper, may I ask, were you present at the will reading today? I met her eyes. Yes. And did they mention this trust? No, the answer came easily. Because I didn't need to think about it. There had been no hesitation in that room.
No confusión.
No mention of anything outside the document they read. She nodded slowly, as if that confirmed something for her. That's unusual, she said carefully. Unusual. That was one way to put it. Another would have been intentional. But I didn't say that out loud. Not yet. Instead, I looked back at the screen. At the numbers. At the structure. At the quiet, careful way everything had been arranged. My father had always been precise. He didn't do things halfway. If he wanted something protected, he made sure it was. And if he wanted something hidden, he made sure no one could find it by accident. I felt something shift again. Not confusion. Not even curiosity anymore. Clarity. Because the more I looked at it, the more one thought settled in. He didn't trust them. Not completely. Maybe not at all. And that changed everything. Can this trust be accessed immediately? I asked. Linda considered that. There are activation conditions, she said. Most of them are tied to legal confirmation of his passing, which has already occurred. The rest are procedural. Procedural, meaning paperwork, verification,
Time.
not obstacles, just steps. And once it's activated, you would have full control, she said. Full control. The words echoed quietly in my mind. Not shared, not divided, not negotiated.
Meaning.
I nodded once. Slowly. All right, I said. I'd like to begin that process. Linda gave a small, professional smile. Of course. She reached for a folder and began organizing documents, sliding a few papers toward me. Some of this will require identification, signatures, standard verification. I took the pen she offered. My hand didn't shake, not even slightly, because by that point, something had already settled inside me. I wasn't the woman who walked into that conference room anymore. And I definitely wasn't the one who walked out of it. I signed where she indicated.
Carefully. Neatly.
Each line deliberate. Each motion steady. Because this wasn't about reacting. It was about understanding. And I understood enough now. When I finished, Linda gathered the papers and placed them back into the folder. I'll begin processing this immediately, she said. You should expect confirmation within a few business days. I nodded. Thank you. I stood up, adjusting my purse over my shoulder again. The same motion as before. The same calm posture. But it didn't feel the same. Because earlier, I had been walking away from something. Now, I was walking toward it. As I reached the door, Linda spoke again. Mrs. Harper. I turned slightly. Yes. She hesitated for just a moment, then said, Your father was very thorough. I held her gaze. I know, I said. And I meant it. Because whatever had happened in that room, whatever they thought they had accomplished, my father had already seen it coming. He had planned for it, prepared for it, and left me exactly what I needed. Not loudly, not publicly, but effectively. I stepped out of the office and walked back through the bank, past the same teller, past the same quiet lobby. Nothing had changed. And yet, everything had. When I reached my car, I paused for a moment before opening the door. Just long enough to let the realization settle completely. They had asked me to leave. As if I didn't belong. As if I had nothing. As if my place in that family had been erased with a few lines on a piece of paper. I opened the car door and got in.
Closed it.
Set my purse beside me. And for the first time since this all began, I allowed myself the smallest, quietest shift in expression. Not a smile. Not yet. But something close. Because now I understood the truth. They hadn't taken anything from me. They had simply revealed themselves. And more importantly, they had no idea what I was holding.
Not yet.
I didn't drive home right away. Again. It was becoming a pattern. Instead, I sat in the car with the engine off this time, the quiet around me no longer heavy but focused. There's a difference. Earlier, silence had felt like something was missing. Now it felt like something was forming. I rested my hands lightly on the steering wheel, not gripping it, just letting them sit there as I looked out through the windshield. The same parking lot. The same late afternoon light. Nothing had changed on the outside. But inside, everything had shifted. Because now I wasn't guessing anymore. I knew. Not everything, but enough. Enough to understand that what happened in that conference room wasn't an ending. It was a move. And not a subtle one. They hadn't just excluded me. They had done it confidently.
Cleanly.
Without hesitation. Which meant they believed they were safe. I let that thought settle for a moment. Because confidence like that doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from information. Or, at least, what they think is information. I reached over and picked up my purse again, opening it slowly. The folded paper was still there. Exactly where I had placed it. I took it out, but this time I didn't unfold it. I didn't need to. I already knew what was inside. What mattered now wasn't what it said. It was what it meant. A trust. Active accounts. A property held for years. Transfers still coming in. None of that happens by accident. And none of it happens without intention. My father hadn't just left something behind. He had separated things. Divided them in a way that wasn't obvious.
Not to them, but to me.
I leaned back slightly in the seat. Because the more I thought about it, the more one question kept returning.
Why?
Why go through all that effort? Why create something hidden instead of simply putting my name in the will like everyone else? The answer didn't come all at once. It rarely does. It came in pieces. Small ones. Memories I hadn't paid attention to before. Moments that didn't seem important at the time. But now they lined up differently. I remembered the last few months of my father's life. The way Daniel started showing up more often. The way Melissa began helping with appointments, with paperwork, with conversations that used to happen privately. The way I was slowly edged out. Not directly. Never directly. It was always subtle. Oh, we already handled that. Don't worry about it. You've done enough. You should get some rest. At the time, I thought they were being considerate. Thought they were trying to take some weight off my shoulders. Now it looked different. Now it looked like positioning. Like control. I exhaled slowly. Because that changed the question. It wasn't just why my father did what he did. It was when he realized he needed to. And that answer felt clearer. He saw it before I did.
He saw the shift.
The way decisions were being made around him instead of with him. The way access to information was being filtered. The way certain conversations stopped happening when others entered the room. My father was many things. But he wasn't unaware. And he wasn't passive. If he believed something was being taken from him, he wouldn't confront it loudly. He would outmaneuver it. Quietly.
Carefully.
I looked down at my hands again. Still steady. Still calm. But now there was something underneath that calm. Not anger. Not yet. Something sharper. Focus. Because now the situation wasn't abstract anymore. It had shape. Structure.
People.
Daniel. Melissa. Maybe others. And whatever role they had played, it hadn't been random. I picked up my phone. Not to call anyone. Not yet. Just to look. I opened my messages. Scrolled through recent conversations. Family group chats. Short replies. Missed calls. I noticed something then. Not something new. Something I had ignored. The timing. Messages that used to come directly to me now came through Daniel. Updates that used to include me now arrived after decisions had already been made. Even the tone had shifted. Less asking, more informing, like I had been moved from participant to observer. I locked the phone and set it down, because I didn't need more proof. I had enough. The rest would come. I glanced back at the bank entrance. Still quiet, still ordinary, but now connected to something much larger than it appeared. And that's when the next thought came. Not emotional, not reactive.
Strategic.
They didn't know. That was the key. Everything they had done, every decision, every move, it was built on one assumption. That I had nothing. That I had been left out. That I would leave quietly and stay gone. I let out a slow breath. Because assumptions like that are dangerous. Not for the person making them. For the person relying on them. I reached for the ignition again. Started the engine. This time, I didn't hesitate. I pulled out of the parking lot, merging back onto the road with steady, controlled movement. Because now there was direction. Not just driving. Not just reacting.
A path.
I wasn't going to confront them.
Not yet.
I wasn't going to correct them. Not yet. Because information is only powerful when it's timed correctly. And right now, silence was still working in my favor. As I drove, one thought stayed with me.
Clear.
Simple. Unshakable. They had already shown me who they were. Now, I was going to see how far they were willing to go. Before they realized they had made a mistake. I didn't go back to my house that evening. Not immediately. Instead, I drove past it. Slowed down just enough to glance at the front porch. The same one I had swept every Sunday morning for years. The same door I had locked behind me earlier that day, without thinking twice. Everything looked exactly the same. But I didn't turn in. I kept driving. Because something told me going back too soon would pull me into old habits. And right now I needed distance. Not from the house. From the version of myself that still expected things to make sense. I drove a few more blocks before finally pulling into a small diner I used to visit with my father. Nothing special. Just a quiet place with soft lighting, simple food, and a waitress who had probably seen the same customers for the past 20 years. I parked, turned off the engine, and sat there for a moment before going in. Inside, it was warm. Comfortably warm. The kind of warmth that doesn't ask questions. A bell chimed softly as I pushed the door open. The same woman stood behind the counter, gray hair, kind eyes, a pen tucked behind her ear. She looked up and smiled. "Haven't seen you in a while," she said. I nodded slightly.
Yeah.
It's been some time. She didn't ask anything else. Just gestured toward a booth by the window. "Sit wherever you like." I chose the same booth my father used to prefer. Back against the wall. Clear view of the entrance. He always said it was habit. I think it was more than that. I slid into the seat and placed my purse beside me. The vinyl creaked softly under the movement. A menu sat in front of me, but I didn't open it. I already knew what I would order. Some things don't change. The waitress came over with a glass of water and set it down gently. "The usual?" she asked. I nodded. "Yes, please." She smiled and walked away. Simple. No pressure. No performance. I rested my hands on the table and looked out the window. Cars passed.
People walked by.
Life moved forward. Unaware. Unbothered. And for the first time that day, I allowed myself to sit still without replaying the will reading. Without replaying their faces. Without replaying the moment my name wasn't called. Because I didn't need to anymore. I already understood it. What I needed now was to understand what came next. The food arrived a few minutes later. Coffee first. Then a plate set down quietly in front of me. I wrapped my hands around the cup.
Warm. Steady.
Grounding. And that's when the next layer started to settle. Not the shock. Not the realization. The strategy. Because now I had something they didn't. Information. Not all of it. But enough. Enough to know they had acted too early. Too confidently. And that gave me space. Space to observe. Space to decide. I took a slow sip of coffee. Bitter.
Familiar.
And I let my thoughts move carefully, not fast, not scattered. Just deliberate. Daniel. He had avoided eye contact. That wasn't guilt. That was control. People who feel guilty tend to overexplain. They justify. They soften things. He didn't do any of that. He stayed quiet. Let Melissa speak. That meant something. I set the cup down. Melissa. She had been the one to say it. You should leave.
Calm. Certain.
Like she had already decided the outcome. Like she knew no one would challenge her. That kind of confidence doesn't come from assumption. It comes from preparation. Which meant one thing. This wasn't just about the will. This had been building. Planned. Step by step. I picked up my fork but didn't eat. Because another thought had just surfaced. Stronger than the others. If they were that confident, then they believed they had full control. Not partial.
Full.
Which meant they thought there were no loose ends. No hidden pieces. No second structure outside of what was read in that room. And that's where they were wrong. I leaned back slightly, eyes still on the window. Because now the situation was clearer than ever. They had played their move.
Publicly.
Decisively. And they expected me to disappear. To accept it. To step out quietly and not come back. I let out a slow breath. Because, in a way, that worked in my favor. No one watching. No one questioning. No one expecting anything from me. That's not weakness. That's cover. The waitress passed by again, refilling my coffee without asking. I gave her a small nod. Thank you. She smiled and moved on. Simple interactions. Normal moments. And yet everything beneath them had changed. I finally took a small bite of food. Not because I was hungry. Because I needed to stay grounded. To stay present. To not rush ahead. Because timing mattered now. Every step. Every decision. Every move. I couldn't afford to react emotionally. Not even slightly. Because the moment I did, I would be playing on their terms. And I wasn't going to do that. I finished my coffee slowly. Left the food mostly untouched. Then reached for my purse again.
Pulled out my phone.
This time, I did something different. I opened Daniel's contact. Stared at it for a moment. Then typed a message.
Short.
Simple.
No emotion.
No need to explain anything today. I understand. I read it once. Then sent it. And placed the phone back down on the table. Because that message wasn't for him. Not really. It was for positioning. To confirm exactly what they believed. That I accepted it. That I wasn't going to question anything. That I was out. I stood up, placed cash on the table, and picked up my purse. The bell chimed again as I walked out. The air outside felt cooler now. Night settling in. I walked to my car, unlocked it, and paused just before getting in. Because one final thought settled into place.
Clear. Precise.
Unavoidable. They thought the story had ended in that room. But it hadn't. It had just started. And the next part wouldn't happen in front of them.
Not yet.
I didn't check my phone right away. Not when I got into the car. Not when I started the engine. Not even when I pulled out of the parking lot and merged into the evening traffic. I already knew what I would see. Or more importantly, what I wouldn't. Still, I let the drive stretch a little longer than necessary. Streetlights flickered on one by one, casting long reflections across the windshield. The sky had shifted into that deep blue just before night fully settles in. Everything felt quieter, more defined, because now every small detail mattered. Every reaction, every silence. I finally pulled over a few blocks from my house, parking beneath a tree I had passed 1,000 times but never really noticed. Then I picked up my phone. One message. Read. No reply. I looked at the screen for a moment longer.
No typing indicated.
No follow-up. Nothing. I nodded slightly to myself and set the phone down, because that told me exactly what I needed to know. If Daniel had been unsure, he would have responded. If there had been any hesitation, any need to explain, to justify, to soften what happened earlier,
he would have said something.
But silence? That wasn't confusion. That was confirmation. He believed it was done. Final.
Clean.
And Melissa? She didn't even bother. No message.
No acknowledgement.
Which meant she didn't feel the need to manage the situation any further. To her, there was nothing left to manage. I rested my hands on the steering wheel again. Fingers relaxed. because now the picture was complete. Not the whole story, but their side of it. And it was exactly what I expected. They had already moved on, filed it away, closed the door. I started the car again and drove the rest of the way home. This time, I turned into the driveway. The house looked the same as it always had.
Quiet. Still.
The porch light was off. No one had been here. Of course not. Why would they be? I stepped out of the car and walked to the front door, unlocking it with the same key I had used for years. The lock clicked softly.
Familiar.
Unchanged. Inside, the air was still. The kind of stillness that comes from a house that hasn't been disturbed. I closed the door behind me and stood there for a moment, just listening.
No voices.
No movement.
No expectations.
And for the first time that day, that silence didn't feel heavy. It felt useful. I set my purse down on the table near the door and walked slowly into the living room. Everything was exactly where I left it that morning. The same chair, the same folded blanket, the same photograph on the shelf. My father, standing in front of the old house years ago, hands in his pockets, expression unreadable as always. I paused in front of it, looked at it for a few seconds, longer than usual. "You knew," I said quietly, not as a question, as a statement, because now I was certain of it. He had seen this coming. Not every detail, not every word that would be said, but the direction, the shift, the way things were moving. And instead of stopping it directly, he prepared for it. I walked into the kitchen and filled a glass of water, taking a slow sip before setting it down on the counter. My movements were calm, measured.
No urgency.
Because rushing would only lead to mistakes. And mistakes were something I couldn't afford right now. I leaned lightly against the counter, thinking, not about what had already happened, but about what they would do next. Because people don't stop after a move like that. They follow through. They consolidate. They make sure there are no loose ends, which meant one thing. At some point, they would check. Not immediately, but soon. They would expect a reaction, a call, a confrontation,
something.
And when it didn't come, that's when curiosity would start. I picked up my phone again, scrolling briefly before setting it back down. No new messages. Still nothing.
Perfect.
Because that gave me time. Time to move without pressure. Time to prepare before they even realized there was something to prepare for. I walked down the hallway toward my bedroom, passing the closed door to my father's old study. I stopped. My hand hovered near the doorknob. I hadn't gone in there since he passed. Not because I couldn't, because I didn't need to. Everything important had already been handled. Or at least that's what I thought. Now, I wasn't so sure. I opened the door slowly. The room smelled faintly of old paper and wood. The desk was still in place. Files stacked neatly. Nothing disturbed. He had always kept things organized. Precise. Intentional. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. Not all the way. Just enough. Because this wasn't about hiding. Not yet. It was about understanding. I moved toward the desk and rested my fingers lightly on the surface. There were small details I recognized. A pen placed exactly where he used to leave it. A folder aligned perfectly with the edge. Nothing random. Nothing careless. I opened one of the drawers. Inside were documents. Some familiar. Some not. I didn't rush. I didn't dig through everything. I just looked carefully. Because I wasn't searching for something specific. Not yet. I was learning the pattern. The way he organized things. The way he separated what mattered. Because if he had hidden something once, he would have done it again. I closed the drawer gently and stepped back, not touching anything else. Because instinct told me this wasn't the moment to uncover everything. Not all at once. Information, like everything else, needed timing. I turned off the light and stepped out of the room, closing the door softly behind me. As I walked back down the hallway, one thought stayed clear in my mind. They believed they had control. They believed everything was already decided. But they hadn't looked closely enough. And they definitely hadn't looked here. I stopped in the living room again, glancing once more at the photograph of my father. This time, I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. Because whatever he had left behind, whatever he had prepared, I was starting to see it,
piece by piece.
and they still had no idea. Not yet. I didn't go to sleep right away that night. I stayed in the living room longer than usual, the lights dim, the house quiet in a way that felt different now. Not empty, not lonely, intentional. I sat in the same chair I always used, hands resting lightly on the armrests, eyes moving slowly across the room. Every object looked the same, but I wasn't looking at them the same way anymore. Because once you realize something has been hidden from you, you stop seeing things as they are. You start seeing them as they might be. I leaned forward slightly and reached for my phone again. Still nothing. No message from Daniel. No call. No attempt to follow up. That told me more than any conversation could have. They weren't worried. Not even a little. Which meant they believed two things. First, that I had accepted what happened.
And
second, that there was nothing left for me to discover. I placed the phone down again, screen facing down this time, because that assumption was exactly what I needed. I stood up slowly and walked back down the hallway. This time, I didn't hesitate when I reached my father's study. I opened the door and stepped inside. Fully, closing it gently behind me. The room felt the same as before. Orderly, controlled, untouched. But now I wasn't just observing it. I was paying attention. There's a difference. I moved toward the desk again, but instead of opening drawers immediately, I looked around first. At the shelves. At the filing cabinets. At the small details that usually go unnoticed. My father didn't believe in clutter. Everything had a place. And more importantly, everything had a reason. That meant if something was here, it wasn't accidental.
I reached for the top drawer this time.
Opened it slowly. Inside were the same documents I had seen earlier. Neatly arranged. Categorized. But now I looked closer. Not just at what was there, but at what wasn't. There were sections labeled clearly.
Property.
Business. Insurance. Each folder aligned. Each tab precise. Too precise. Because something about it felt incomplete. I slid one of the folders out. Opened it. Read just enough to understand. Standard documentation. Nothing unusual. Nothing hidden. I placed it back exactly where it had been. Then moved to the second drawer. Same structure. Same order. Same surface-level clarity. And that's when it became obvious. This wasn't where he kept the real information. This was where he kept the version people were meant to find. Organized.
Clean.
Accessible. But not complete. I closed the drawer slowly. Because now I wasn't searching randomly anymore. I was looking for separation. For layers. For the places where something didn't quite match the rest. I stepped back and turned my attention to the bookshelf. It stretched along the wall. Rows of books, binders, and a few framed photos. Nothing out of place. Nothing messy. But then again, that was exactly how he would hide something. In plain sight. I moved closer, running my fingers lightly along the spines. Some were worn. Some untouched. A few binders stood out, thicker than the rest, labeled in his handwriting.
Dates. Years.
Nothing specific. Just enough to look ordinary. I pulled one out.
Set it on the desk.
Opened it. Inside were records. Transactions. Older ones. Not current, but detailed. Very detailed. I flipped through a few pages, not rushing, just scanning, looking for patterns. And then I saw it.
A name.
Not mine. Not Daniel's. Not Melissa's. A company name I didn't recognize. But I had seen it before. Not here. Somewhere else. I paused, thinking. Then it clicked. The bank. The transfer source Linda had shown me. It was the same name. I sat down slowly in my father's chair. Because that changed something. This wasn't just a trust. It was connected. Structured. Layered across different places. And if this binder was here, then there were others. I looked back at the shelf. At the row of similar binders. Same size. Same style. Different years. I didn't open them all.
Not yet.
Because I didn't need to. I had already confirmed the pattern. He separated things by time, by structure, by access, which meant whatever I needed was here. just not obvious. I closed the binder and placed it back exactly where I found it. Then I leaned back in the chair, letting the realization settle. My father hadn't just hidden assets. He had built a system. One that required patience to understand. One that couldn't be uncovered in a single moment. And more importantly, one that couldn't be taken easily. I exhaled slowly, because now I understood something else. This wasn't going to be about reacting, or confronting, or even proving anything right away. This was going to be about timing, about knowing when to act, and when to stay quiet. I stood up and turned off the desk lamp. The room dimmed slightly, back to how it had been before, undisturbed, unnoticed. I walked to the door and opened it, stepping back into the hallway. The house was still quiet,
Still the same.
but now it felt different in a very specific way, like it was holding something, waiting. I moved back into the living room and paused again, near the photograph of my father. This time, I didn't speak. I just looked, because I didn't need answers anymore. Not immediately. I had direction, and that was enough. I picked up my phone one last time before heading to bed. Still no messages. No calls. Nothing. I set it down on the table and turned off the lights. Because tomorrow, I wouldn't be reacting to what they did. I would be continuing what he started. And they still wouldn't see it coming. Not yet. I woke up earlier than usual the next morning. Not because I had somewhere to be. Because my mind had already moved ahead. There's a certain kind of clarity that comes after everything settles. Not emotional clarity, not relief, something more structured than that. Like pieces falling into place quietly overnight. I didn't rush out of bed. I sat there for a moment, letting the stillness of the house settle around me again.
Same walls.
Same silence. But now it felt different.
Not like a place I was holding on to.
More like a place that was holding something for me. I got up, dressed simply, and made a cup of coffee. No television. No background noise. Just the sound of the kettle, the cup, the quiet rhythm of movement. Because today wasn't about reacting. It was about confirming. I carried the coffee into the living room and sat down, reaching for my phone out of habit. Still nothing. No missed calls. No messages. No, are you okay? No, we should talk. Nothing. I nodded once, almost unconsciously, because that silence had now extended into a full night. And that meant one thing. They weren't just confident. They were comfortable. Comfortable enough to move forward without checking behind them. Comfortable enough to assume there was nothing left to manage. That was important, because people only reveal their next move when they think no one is watching. I set the phone down and took a slow sip of coffee. Then I stood up and walked back to my father's study. This time I didn't pause at the door. I opened it and stepped inside like I belonged there. Because I did. The morning light filtered in through the window, landing across the desk in a way that made everything look sharper.
Clearer.
Less like memory, more like structure. I moved directly to the bookshelf.
No hesitation. No second-guessing.
Because now I wasn't exploring. I was following a line. I pulled out the same binder from the night before. Opened it again. Flipped to the page I had seen. The company name. The same one connected to the transfers. I studied it longer this time.
Not just recognizing it.
Understanding it. Because this wasn't just a random holding. This was a bridge. Between what was public and what wasn't. I set the binder down and reached for another one. A different year. Same structure. Same labels. I opened it. Flipped through. And there it was again. The same company. Recurring. Consistent. Not a one-time transaction. A system. I sat down slowly in my father's chair. Because now it wasn't just a suspicion. It was a pattern. And patterns don't lie. They repeat. They connect. They reveal intention. I leaned back slightly, letting the information settle. Because this confirmed something I had already started to understand. My father didn't separate things randomly. He layered them. The will was one layer. Visible. Accessible. Expected. But this was something else. Something built over time. Something designed not to be seen unless you knew where to look. I closed the binder and placed it back carefully. Then reached for the drawer again. This time, I opened it with purpose. Not scanning, not guessing, looking for differences, for anything that didn't match the pattern of the rest. Folders, documents, everything aligned, everything predictable, except one space, near the back, slightly off, barely noticeable, but not perfect. I reached in and pulled the folder out. It wasn't labeled the same way as the others. No category.
Not that.
Just a plain cover. That was enough. I opened it. Inside were few documents. Not many, but different. No standard formatting.
No summary pages.
Just direct records, agreements, signatures, and one document that stood out immediately because it had my name on it, not typed.
Written.
In my father's handwriting. I didn't react right away. I just looked at it.
Carefully.
Because this wasn't something to rush through. I read the first line, then the second, and slowly, the structure became clear. It wasn't a will. Not exactly.
It wasn't a
simple transfer either. It was something more controlled. A directive. Connected to the trust. Connected to the company. Connected to everything I had just seen. And it had conditions. Specific ones. Activation points. Triggers. I exhaled slowly. Because now I understood why my name hadn't been called. It wasn't an omission. It was separation. Deliberate.
Strategic.
He hadn't left me out. He had moved me out of reach. I closed the folder gently and held it in my hands for a moment, not tightening my grip, just acknowledging it, because this changed the entire structure of what had happened. Everything they believed was built on incomplete information, and incomplete information leads to mistakes. I stood up and placed the folder back where I found it, exactly as it had been, because this wasn't the moment to take anything. Not yet. This was the moment to understand everything. I stepped back from the desk and looked around the room one more time. Now I wasn't seeing objects. I was seeing intention. Every placement, every layer, every decision. My father had built this quietly, over time, without drawing attention. And now, it was my responsibility to see it through. I turned and walked toward the door, stopping just before stepping out, because one final thought settled in clearly. They believed the will was the final word. They believed control had already been decided. They believed I had been removed from the equation. I turned off the light, stepped into the hallway,
and closed the door behind me.
They weren't just wrong. They were operating inside a version of the truth that no longer applied. And the longer they stayed there, the harder it would be for them to see what was coming. I didn't go back into the study immediately after that. That would have been too direct, too obvious. Instead, I moved through the rest of the house like everything was normal, because that mattered now. Not for me, for the situation. I made breakfast. Simple.
Eggs. Toast. Coffee.
The same routine I had followed for years. Not because I was hungry, because routine keeps you grounded. And right now, I needed to stay grounded. Not ahead. Not emotional. Just steady.
I sat at the
kitchen table, eating slowly, my phone resting beside my plate. Still nothing. No messages. No missed calls. No attempt to reach me, which told me something important. They weren't just comfortable anymore. They were moving on. Because people don't stay silent this long unless they believe there's nothing left to say. And that meant one thing. They had already shifted their focus. From me to what they thought they now controlled. I took another sip of coffee and let that settle. Because that's when people make mistakes. Not when they're planning. When they think the plan has already worked. I finished breakfast, cleaned the dishes, and wiped down the counter. Slowly.
Carefully.
Every movement intentional. Because the moment you rush, you lose control of the pace. And right now, the pace mattered more than anything. I picked up my phone again. This time, I didn't check messages. I opened my email. Scrolled. Nothing from Daniel. Nothing from Melissa. But there was something else. A notification I hadn't noticed earlier. From the bank. Subject line simple. Account update confirmation. I opened it. Read it once. Then again. The activation process had started. Not completed yet, but in motion. That was enough.
Because now there was a timeline.
Not theirs.
Meaning.
I locked the phone and set it down, then stood up and walked back to the study. This time, I didn't hesitate at all. I opened the door and stepped inside like it was already mine to manage. Because it was. The room felt different in the daylight. Less like memory, more like structure. I went straight to the drawer, opened it, pulled out the same folder. And this time, I read it fully, line by line.
No skipping. No assumptions.
Because details matter, especially the ones written quietly. The document wasn't complicated, but it was precise. Clear in a way that left no room for interpretation.
The trust.
The company. The property. They weren't separate. They were connected. Structured in a way that required one piece to activate the others. And that piece was me. Not publicly. Not in the will. But here. In writing. In his handwriting. I ran my fingers lightly across the edge of the paper. Not emotionally. Just acknowledging the weight of it. Because now I understood something even more important. This wasn't just protection. It was control. My father hadn't just hidden assets from them. He had ensured they couldn't access them.
Even if they tried.
Even if they believed they had everything. They didn't. And more importantly, they couldn't. I closed the folder slowly, placed it back exactly where it had been. Because nothing needed to be moved yet. Everything was still working in my favor. I stepped back and looked around the room again. This time, I wasn't searching. I was confirming. Everything was in place. Nothing disturbed. Nothing missing.
Good.
Because that meant they hadn't been here. Not recently. Which meant they didn't know. Not about this.
Not about any of it.
I turned and walked out of the study, closing the door behind me.
Softly.
Because the less attention, the better. Back in the living room, I picked up my phone again. This time, I opened Daniel's contact. Not to message. To observe. The last message I had sent still sat there.
Read.
No reply. I stared at it for a moment, then locked the phone again. Because that silence was still doing its job. Holding their position in place. Keeping them exactly where they believed they were. And that gave me room to move. I walked to the window and looked out at the street. A car passed. Someone walking their dog. Normal. Unchanged. And yet everything beneath it had shifted. Because now I had confirmation. Not just suspicion. Not just pieces. Structure. And structure changes how you act. I wasn't guessing anymore. I wasn't reacting. I was preparing. I turned away from the window and walked back to the kitchen, setting my phone down on the counter. Then I reached for a notepad. Opened it. And for the first time since all of this began, I started writing. Not everything. Just key points.
The trust.
The company. The activation timeline. The connections between them. Because information in your head is one thing. Information organized is something else. And I needed clarity. Not just understanding.
Clarity.
I wrote slowly. Deliberately. Each word placed with purpose. Because this wasn't about remembering.
It was.
About planning. When I finished, I set the pen down and looked at the page.
Clean.
Simple. But powerful. Because now it wasn't just in my mind. It was real. Structured. Actionable. I closed the notepad and set it aside. Then picked up my phone one more time. Still nothing. I allowed the smallest pause. Just enough to let that sink in fully. Because that silence was no longer surprising. It was useful. I placed the phone down again and leaned lightly against the counter. Because now the situation had shifted again. Not outwardly. Not visibly. But fundamentally. They believed the story had ended. They believed they had control. They believed I was gone from the equation. And I had let them believe it. That was the important part. Because once people settle into a belief, they stop questioning it. And when they stop questioning, that's when you act. Not before. Not during. After. I straightened slightly and took a slow breath. Because the next step wasn't about discovery anymore. It was about timing. And timing was finally on my side. I didn't leave the house that afternoon. There was no reason to. Everything I needed was already here. And for the first time since this started, I wasn't thinking about what they had done. I was thinking about what they were about to do next. Because people like Daniel, like Melissa, they don't stop at one move. They follow through. They secure. They confirm control. And control, for them, meant access. I stood in the kitchen for a while, not moving, just letting that thought settle. Then I picked up my phone again, not to check messages, to wait. Because if I was right, they wouldn't stay silent much longer. Not out of concern, out of logistics. I set the phone down on the counter and walked back toward the living room, keeping my pace slow, measured.
No urgency.
Because reacting too early would shift the balance. And right now, the balance was exactly where I needed it. About 20 minutes later, my phone rang. Daniel. I let it ring once.
Twice.
3 times. Then I answered. Hello. My voice was calm, even, neutral. There was a short pause on the other end. Not long, but noticeable. Hey, he said finally. I just wanted to check in.
Check in.
Not apologize. Not explain. Just check in. I'm fine, I said. Another pause. Good, he replied. I figured yesterday was a lot. A lot. That was how he chose to describe it. I didn't respond to that. I didn't need to. Because silence has a way of making people fill the space. We're going to be handling a few things over the next couple of days, he continued. Paperwork, transferring accounts, that kind of thing. There it was. I leaned lightly against the wall, my eyes steady, my expression unchanged. All right, I said. I just wanted to make sure there weren't any complications, he added. Complications. I almost smiled, but I didn't. No, I said. There won't be. The words came out clean, simple, exactly what he needed to hear. Because this wasn't a conversation. It was confirmation, on his side, that everything had gone according to plan. That's good, he said quickly. That's really good. He sounded relieved, not emotionally.
Practically.
Like a task had been cleared. We'll probably finalize most of it by the end of the week, he continued. After that, things should settle. Settle. I nodded slightly, even though he couldn't see it. Of course, I said. Another pause. Shorter this time. Less uncertain. Because now he had what he called for. Reassurance.
Control.
All right, he said. I'll let you go. Okay. The line went quiet. Then the call ended. I lowered the phone slowly, set it back on the counter, and stood there for a moment, not moving, because that conversation had just confirmed everything, not just what they believed, but what they were about to do. Transfer accounts, finalize paperwork, move assets. They weren't waiting. They were acting. And that mattered, because timing doesn't just apply to response. It applies to action. I walked back into the living room and sat down, hands resting lightly in my lap, thinking.
Not fast.
Not scattered. Just structured. They believed they had access. They believed they had authority. They believed the will gave them control. But the structure I had seen,
The trust.
the company, the connections, that wasn't something you could bypass. Not without the key. And the key was me. I exhaled slowly. Because now it wasn't just about understanding anymore. It was about letting them move first. Letting them reach. Letting them try to access something that wasn't actually theirs. Because that's when mistakes happen. Not before. Not during planning. When execution meets reality. I reached for the notepad again. Opened it. Added one line. End of week, their timeline. Then I set the pen down. Because now I had alignment. Their schedule. My structure. And the gap between the two. I closed the notepad and leaned back in the chair. Eyes steady. Mind clear. Because everything was exactly where it needed to be. They were moving forward with incomplete information. And incomplete information always leads to exposure. I picked up my phone one last time and looked at the call log. Daniel's name's still there. Recent.
Short.
Efficient. Just like the conversation. I locked the phone and placed it face down on the table. Because there was nothing left to confirm. Nothing left to question. Only one thing left to do.
Wait.
Not passively, not uncertainly, but deliberately. Because timing wasn't just on my side anymore. It was becoming my advantage. And by the time they realized it, they would already be too far in, too committed, too exposed to step back. I sat there in the quiet room, the same house, the same chair, the same light filtering in through the window. Everything looked unchanged. But underneath it, everything had shifted. And they still believed. They were in control. The rest of that week moved exactly the way I expected it to. Quiet on the surface. Busy underneath. Daniel didn't call again. Melissa didn't reach out. No messages.
No updates.
Just silence. The kind of silence that only exists when people believe everything is already settled. I didn't break that silence. I let it stretch. Because the longer they stayed comfortable, the clearer their next move would become. 3 days later, my phone buzzed. This time it wasn't a call. It was a message. From Daniel. We're finalizing everything tomorrow morning. Just a heads up. I read it once. Then again. Same tone.
Short.
Practical. Confident. They were moving forward. Exactly like
he said.
End of the week. I didn't reply right away. I set the phone down and walked slowly to the window, looking out at the same quiet street. Because this was the moment. Not emotional. Not dramatic. Just precise. I picked up my purse. Checked that the folded paper was still inside.
It was.
Then I grabbed my keys. And left the house. The bank looked the same as before. Same glass doors. Same quiet lobby. Same controlled environment. But this time, I wasn't walking in with questions. I was walking in with confirmation. Linda looked up when I entered. Recognition came immediately. Mrs. Harper. I nodded. Good morning. She stood and gestured toward her office. I was actually about to call you, she said. Of course she was. We walked in together, and she closed the door behind us. Then she turned the screen toward me. It's been activated, she said. No build-up.
No hesitation.
Just the truth. I looked at the screen. Accounts. Assets. Property. Everything connected. Everything now accessible. Under my name. Fully. Completely. I didn't react outwardly. Didn't lean forward. Didn't smile. I just took it in. Because this wasn't the moment for emotion. This was the moment for clarity. And the company? I asked. Linda nodded. You are now listed as the controlling party.
Controlling party.
The words settled differently now. Not abstract. Not potential.
Real.
I exhaled slowly. Thank you, I said. She gave a small, respectful nod. If there's anything else you need, there is, I said calmly. She paused. I'd like to restrict access, I continued. Immediately.
No explanation. No elaboration.
Just instruction. She understood. People like her always do. I'll take care of that right away, she said. A few clicks. A few confirmations. Quiet. Efficient.
Done.
I stood up. Adjusted my purse. Same motion as always. Same calm posture. But this time it meant something different. Because now, everything was in place. I didn't go home after that. Not immediately. Instead, I drove. Not aimlessly. Just giving the moment space to settle. Because what happens after the truth is revealed matters just as much as the truth itself. My phone rang about 20 minutes later. Daniel. Right on time. I answered. Hello. There was no pause this time.
No hesitation.
Just tension. We're having a problem, he said. I leaned back slightly in the seat. Eyes forward. What kind of problem? The accounts, he said quickly. They're not accessible. I let a small silence sit between us. Not long. Just enough. I see, I said. We were told everything was cleared, he continued. But now there are restrictions, new ones.
Do you know anything about that?
There it was. The moment. The gap between what they believed and what was real. I didn't rush. Didn't fill the space. I let him sit in it. No, I said calmly. I don't. Another pause. Longer this time. Because now uncertainty had entered his side of the conversation. Something's off, he said. We're going back to the lawyer. All right, I replied. Then I ended the call. Not abruptly, not dramatically, just finished. I set the phone down and looked out at the road ahead. Because I didn't need to explain anything.
Not yet.
They would figure it out.
Piece by piece.
The same way I did, only slower, and with far less control. That evening, I went back home. The house felt the same. Quiet.
Still.
But now complete. I walked into the living room and stopped in front of my father's photograph again. This time I didn't just look. I understood. You didn't leave me out, I said softly. You moved me out of reach. The words settled into the room without echo. Because they didn't need to. They were already true. I stood there for a moment longer, then turned off the light. They never asked me to leave again. They never told me I didn't belong. And they never spoke about that the same way. Because by the time they understood what had really happened, it was too late. Not for me.
For them.
I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I didn't fight. I simply stepped back.
Watched.
Understood. And moved when it mattered. Because sometimes, the strongest thing you can do is nothing at all until it's time. And when that time comes, you don't need to prove anything. You just need to let the truth do what it was always meant to do.